What's up, you guys? Welcome to my living room. Today we're going to talk about 4 different categories of rifles at kind of different price points and some of the highlights of things you can expect in each one of them. It's not always worth stepping up in rifle. So first, the category of problems, just stuff that's wrong with your gun and you're going to have to send it back to the manufacturer or just deal with it. I find a ton of those issues with the very cheapest rifles. As we get into the mid-tier, I find that those problems go away and those guns are, virtually problem-free. But then as we get into the higher-end rifles, we start to see more customer service needs and more problems. Still not as much as the cheap stuff, but more than the mid-tier. And the reason is, on the high end, you think you're buying problem-free, but you're actually buying cutting edge. You know, we're trying this new carbon fiber wrap on this barrel, and then it ends up that it kind of unravels at the end. They're trying a new trigger in this gun that can set down to 1 pound, and then we see, oh, maybe it goes off when you don't want it to. They're pushing the edges, and so there are problems in those kind of guns. They're also not as mass produced, so they don't have as big of samples to kind of figure out the problems with. Next, let's go to accuracy. I looked at my Excel data on all of the rifles I've ever reviewed, these plus probably double this many again. And the interesting thing that I found is there's not a ton of correlation between the accuracy of a rifle and the price of the rifle to a certain extent. In the bottom end, again, we find a lot of rifles that just don't shoot well. I've highlighted on this channel some of the inexpensive guns I've reviewed that did have accuracy problems. You also find diamonds in the rough. The Ruger American's a super accurate, inexpensive rifle. But when you get into that mid-tier, I almost never find any kind of accuracy issue. They just all shoot. And then as you spend a lot more money, sometimes you'll get that gun that will shoot half minute, but usually it's still kind of that same 3/4 MOA that you're finding at that $600, $800 price point. And so raw bench rest accuracy, don't expect it to just groups getting smaller and smaller and smaller the more money you pay. That's not necessarily true. What is true though is as you get to the more expensive rifles, some of the rifle makers are kind of assuming that you're going to be a hand loader, and so you'll find magazines that are the correct length so that you can seat out a bullet as long as you would want for the rifle. You'll see free bore in the chamber is really constricted. Often the more expensive rifles are going to have tighter chamber tolerances around the cartridge. I've talked with a lot of the manufacturers and they've just straight up told me, yeah, when we order our reamers, we go extra big because we don't want any problems. In those inexpensive rifles, often they're going to try to get a little bit more slop in there, especially with some of the newer cartridges, Creedmoors, PRCs, etc., so they don't deal with returns and problems. Now, I mentioned accuracy previously, but then there's also the accuracy guarantee. On the cheap end, they don't have an accuracy guarantee at all, much less a 1 MOA accuracy guarantee. And they're all going to guarantee 1 MOA accuracy. That's really good because if you do have just a problem, a gun that just will not shoot, you can at least get it addressed. So I said the raw bench rest accuracy really doesn't change much between the different rifles up to a point. But what will change is your ability to shoot well positionally when you're actually hunting. In fact, we can do like a woodpecker test on these rifles. You go down to these cheap ones and they're going to sound very hollow. Oh, that one's really hollow. And then we get to don't drop guns. Then we get to kind of the still sounding pretty hollow. And then as we move up, we start to see some very stiff stocks. This Bagara is absolutely very stiff. So I don't really care what a stock sounds like, I care how it performs. A stock like this is just not going to help you to make precision shots. You'll see it's completely rounded in the front, right? And so when I'm resting this on a tree limb, when I'm resting it on the edge of a ground blind, on anything, on a sandbag even, it's just not getting that flat lay. And so it's going to be harder for the crosshairs to go dead that you can shoot well, right? That's a big issue. With this rifle, you'll see how big of a difference is. They have this negative comb, which is a good thing, but it goes so far down below where your scope would be that there's no way you're going to get a cheek weld. You'd have to hover up. And so your head is just kind of hovering. You're just not going to be able to shoot as accurately as something maybe in the midpoint, like this rifle. This thing has an adjustable cheek piece. I get just a perfect look through it as soon as I put it up. I can adjust the length of pull. It's flat on the fore end. That makes a big difference, but you don't have to have that type of stock. I'm going to be showing you guys this in a future video, but this is the MDT Oryx chassis, adjustable comb, adjustable length of pull, super rigid. This is a cheap stock you could use on most any one of these rifles to give it a big upgrade, or of course in a custom. Overall, if you get a really well-designed stock, it's going to make you look like you're a better shooter than you are. I can certainly shoot some of these stocks a lot better than others. Next, let's talk creature comforts. So I really hate sling studs. I really don't like them. The sling studs, just like this right here, this is a terrible attachment system for a sling. The problem is you go shoot this on bags, and what happens when you shoot? Well, that's going to ride on the bag and be moving the gun around. I've torn up some bags that way. Plus, it holds the gun with the sharp parts against your back, and so it's really uncomfortable to walk with all day. I really like seeing on more expensive guns, they've gotten smart attachment points. So take a look at this one. Up here close, look up here close. You can see there's a Picatinny rail to attach your bipod, way stronger than a sling stud for attaching a bipod. And then this is a QD flush cup. This is where I say all sling studs should go away, because with a QD flush cup, a sling like this, you just pop it in, done. So much easier than the sling stud, and it doesn't protrude, so we get this flat bottom on the gun. Some of these manufacturers are really smart about how they're integrating these, and they're putting them on the side. So now you get to hold this with the flat part of the rifle against your back. It's just a lot more comfortable. This is just a better system. A little piece of Picatinny and a QD flush cup can't cost more than a few quarters, right? Maybe this is 50, 75 cents if you're producing this in huge mass, right? And so I would love to see all rifle manufacturers using QD flush cups and Picatinny. I think it's just a much better system, or even better, Arca. But then other creature comforts you'll notice are just a higher quality butt pad. My favorite butt pad is from Limb Saver. I think it's probably the best in the industry right now. So many of them are so stiff that it isn't just doing much. A lot of the cheaper rifles just don't use a good quality butt pad, and so you feel that recoil a little bit more. Let's get into triggers. So in the mass-produced rifles, unfortunately, and I strongly disagree with it, but SAMI has a standard for hunting rifles that it should be 3 pounds as a safety thing, so that that trigger doesn't get accidentally pulled as you're hunting. Now, personally, I can shoot a lot more accurately with a trigger that's, down in that 2-pound range. And so I like to see that. In these mass-produced rifles, it's not gonna happen. In the more expensive rifles, you see a lot more willingness of the manufacturers to use, a Trigger Tech special trigger, put it in there, and you just get that absolutely crisp pull. It's a beautiful experience. Now, I don't want to overstate it. You can take a really cheap trigger, and if you get really used to how that works, you can still shoot it very accurately. But it's another one of those nice things to have. Feeding is probably the biggest difference that I see in price point. And this is one where, in my experience at least, I have seen a direct correlation between the price of the rifle and how well that thing feeds. In those very inexpensive, cheap rifles, they'll kind of chamber it in everything. They'll use the kind of same mag for a lot of different cartridges, even some that it doesn't fit very well. They won't do all the testing in those cartridges. They'll use plastic magazines and plastic attachments for that magazine, and it just doesn't feed very well. As you get more expensive, you see people who are spending more time getting those feed ramps right, getting everything to work properly. And so in my experience, the more you spend on the rifle, generally the better it's going to feed. Better metals is another one that I think is a big deal. I don't understand all of the finer points in metals. What I can tell you is the practical difference. For example, we went hunting with several guys, but it was just one of those days where it was just raining all day. You just could not get dry. And at the end of that day, this is what that guy's Savage Axis barrel looked like. And now you can't fault him for, not taking care of his rifle. It was just raining all day. We just couldn't get dry. We were out hunting and it just looked bad at the end of that day. Also, he had on that factory scope on an inexpensive rifle. It fogged up in the first hour and it was just impossible for him to even use his rifle on the hunt. And that's the kind of thing that can happen with those cheaper rifles. Problems that don't show up in the store, and then you take it on a hunt and you're like, oh my gosh, my hunt got ruined by this thing that probably would have been solved if we had a different class of rifle. Now, mentioning that, the barrels of the inexpensive guns are almost always blued, but that's not to say that bluing is a bad thing. This is also blued with a very high gloss blue on this Air Arms TX200, and it is gorgeous. It's so well done. I mean, that thing is never gonna rust. There are a lot of different processes for bluing, and so just because a rifle is blued doesn't mean it's poor quality. It just often on the inexpensive rifles, they're not doing a good enough process on it. You'll see a lot in the mid-tier rifles. They're going to stainless and Cerakote, or of course the carbon fiber barrels in the more expensive rifles. Weight is another big one. Carbon fiber really has changed hunting rifles permanently. If you're the backcountry hunter, it's a huge advantage to have a super lightweight gun. And so something like this, where I have a carbon fiber stock, carbon fiber wrapped barrel, a very lightweight, higher end Vortex Razor scope. This is a super lightweight package. And because the stock's designed well, you really don't get bad recoil and you can still shoot it very accurately. In the inexpensive rifles, sometimes they are very light because they're using a very sleek stock design, a skinny little contour on the barrel to kind of save some weight and materials cost. And so some of the very inexpensive rifles are pretty light, and then the expensive ones are light. A lot of times in the mid-tier, they get a little bit heavier because they're using a fiberglass stock or partial fiberglass in the stock. They're foam filling the stock. They're using a little heavier contour on that barrel, etc. And last is the looks. There's a big difference in how much the manufacturers put into just how cool a rifle looks as you kind of step up in price. The least expensive ones look like a basic rifle, and you get a little bit more exotic and cool looking if that's something that matters to you. Coming up very soon, we're going to be putting that guy together. The 7mm PRC is coming to Backfire in just a few days.